Chapter 21 The Land of Hope. It was now Friday, 2 p.m. Only 4 days had passed since Trezon's demise. Already, most of the dead had been buried, the rubble had been cleared, a memorial to the fallen had been erected, and construction on the thousands of new houses was well underway. The citizens were all filled with hope and optimism. To reflect the positive mood and future aspirations of its citizens, the Land of the Lonely was renamed the Land of Hope. Dementia and Willowwood were true to their word and set off to collect Alex McKenzie. At exactly 2:01 p.m. on Friday, the 27th of January 2007, they arrived to pick me up. Me, Alex McKenzie, your storyteller. I was so pleased and relieved to see the aging soul wizard and young Elkwoodian orphan king again. Their appearance meant that the evil Trezon had been defeated. I knew this because Dementia had told me that they would only return to take me to the Land of the Lonely if and when this hideous creature had been destroyed. It therefore disturbed me greatly that Dementia looked so anxious and subdued. He made me feel as though I were in the company of the vanquished rather than the victor. His forehead was so deeply frowned that it resembled the thick rubber treading of a hiking boot. His jade-green eyes lacked their normal focus, and he fidgeted nervously with the gizmos and gadgets in his enormous pockets. He was difficult to engage with and left most of the speaking to Willowwood. Every time he did speak, he unconsciously pushed the tip of Old Faithful into his thick mop of wabbit hair and twirled the hair around her shrewdwood stem. It was like he was using Old Faithful as an enormous curling iron. Midway through sentences, he would drift off and forget what he was saying. His mind was clearly a million miles away. Willowwood had to repeatedly tap him on the shoulders to regain his attention. Between sentences, he continually bit down nervously on his bottom lip with such intensity that it left permanent teeth marks. I desperately wanted to know what was bothering this gentle soul wizard so profoundly, but sensed that all would be revealed when the time was right. Willowwood, on the other hand, was far less reserved and much more relaxed than he had been during our first encounter. He looked like a kid who had overcome adversity and was now enjoying the spoils of victory. He no longer had that shell-shocked look on his face. It had been replaced by an air of happiness and confidence. He thoroughly enjoyed giving me a blow-by-blow account of the battle with Trezon. He removed his slingshot from his pocket and replayed the fatal shot with real pride in his eyes. I was also relieved to hear from Willowwood that all of their closest companions had survived. I would finally get to meet Magica, Frother, Hairy, Sked, Fluffle, and Hildegard. I was absolutely delighted to hear about the unexpected discovery of Violina. As Willowwood spoke about her, his eyes sparkled. He was clearly smitten by her. I was saddened to hear that quite a few sugar fairies, Doolan dragons, Burlean dragon slayers, Koolaboos and Lentinas had died in battle. Was it perhaps these losses that were still playing heavily on Dementia's mind? I found the account of how Hairy had slept through the entire battle to be hysterical. Dementia warned me to never speak of it in front of the pumpkin-shaped gluten spider, though, because he was still super sensitive about it. He felt as though he'd let his entire team down. I liked the new name, Land of Hope. It spoke of new beginnings and future potential. I envisioned with time something emerging with a similar appearance to the Garden of Eden. I must say that I found the journey to the Land of Hope to be a very surreal experience. One moment, I was standing motionless in my secret cave in Tiddly Creek. The next moment, I was being propelled in all directions at enormous speed through pitch darkness towards a totally new world. My body was jerked around quite severely. I was filled with both fear and exhilaration at exactly the same time. It was like travelling on a blisteringly fast roller coaster whilst wearing a blindfold. It took a lot of self-restraint to stop myself from screaming. This awkward feeling continued for what felt like about 30 seconds. In reality, it was no more than 5 seconds. Dementia assured me of this. He also apologised for the bumpy ride. Apparently there's no way to predetermine whether or not a teleportation ride will encounter turbulence. Suddenly, the darkness disappeared and was replaced by blinding brightness. As my eyes slowly adapted to their new environment, the land of hope began to reveal itself. The impact of the recent battle was immediately obvious. Most of the houses had been reduced to rubble, and most of the vegetation had been reduced to dust. The ground was black and charred. The air smelt sooty, and swirling smoke burned my eyes. Strange-looking creatures of varying descriptions were busily digging 8 enormous holes. Each hole was about the size of an average backyard swimming pool. Sadly, I was soon to find out that these were for the 8 fallen Doolan dragons and their unfortunate Burlean dragon slayer companions. Much smaller holes that had already been covered over with soil marked the graves of the brave Koolaboos and Lentinas who had also given up their lives for the cause. This vista of gloom was softened by 23 beautiful mini rainbows that glistened through the smoke and filled the air with an incredible feeling of hope. Each represented one of the 23 sugar fairies who had died in the battle to defeat Trezon. Apparently, these rainbows remain for up to a month after a fairy's death. The better their deeds whilst alive, the longer their rainbows last. I found this concept totally fascinating and spiritually uplifting. However, nothing filled my heart with more hope than the sudden appearance of Magica, Frother, and Harry. I could not believe how small and petite Magica was, and how enormous and broad Frother was. Harry looked just the way I had expected. Magica was hovering just above Frother's enormous blue mohawk. Her feathered wings were fluttering at 1,000,000 miles an hour. She was dressed in a slinky black cobweb outfit that had been designed by the talented Harry, and was wearing her signature stodgy black makeup and nail polish. The edges of Magica's lips were stained maroon from sucking on sugar fruits all day. She had a half-eaten sugar fruit in her left hand and an untouched one protruding out of the top of her fairy backpack. They looked almost identical to the small candy cane sticks that my mum always buys us at Christmas time. I was dying to try one. Magica was clearly very excited to meet me. Her face was filled with joy and her crystal blue eyes sparkled like well-cut sapphires. Frother appeared to be quite shy and simply smiled at me reassuringly. Harry was using Frother's body like his own private jungle gym. He was jumping from his nostrils onto his forehead and then back down to his nostrils again. I put this strange behaviour down to him being a little bit nervous, almost like a fight-flight reaction. He had obviously heard bad things about Earthlings. "Welcome to the land of hope," smiled Magica warmly in my direction. "You must be Alex of Earth." "That's me," I smiled proudly. I'd never been addressed in this way before. I kind of liked it, though. I thought Alex of Earth had quite a regal ring to it. It was certainly much more exciting than Alex of Tiddly Creek, Farmer Jonah's son, or plain old Alex McKenzie. Magica suddenly swooped down and gave me a huge kiss on my right cheek. "Welcome, Alex of Earth, our new companion," she giggled. I was not expecting this kiss and my face went beetroot red. Willowwood later informed me that sugar fairies are extremely affectionate and love handing out kisses to all their friends, no matter how recent the friendship is. I was not used to being kissed by females full stop. Now I was with a gothic Barbie doll-looking sugar fairy who handed out kisses willy-nilly. The only females who'd ever kissed me before this were my mother, Grace, and my younger sisters, Leah and Rachel, so I was taken by complete surprise. Magica panicked as she saw my facial complexion change so dramatically and with such speed. "I'm awfully sorry," she cried. "I had no idea that Earthlings are allergic to fairy contact. What are we going to do, Dementia? What are we going to do?" Dementia mumbled and fumbled frantically as he looked around for Old Faithful. He'd forgotten that she was now permanently tied to his waist and hanging downwards in her Lentina scale sheath, a gift from Hildegard's grateful parents. Harry had been the only one to miss out on the recent battle with Trezon, and desperately wanted to make up for it by doing something noble or heroic. He saw this situation as a perfect opportunity to redeem himself. "Harry, to the rescue!" his lisp screamed, and without warning he launched himself from the safety of Frother's enormous nose. He landed plonk on top of my ginger-covered head. I can tell you firsthand that having 10 kilograms of bright orange spider meat come crashing down on one's head is a very unpleasant experience. However, it was nowhere near as unpleasant as the painful slaps to my face that followed from his 30 enormous limbs, all covered in hairs as coarse and sharp as those on a prickly pear. I felt like I'd been whacked in the face by a flat paddle cactus. His 30 limbs engulfed my entire face and I could hardly breathe. I felt intense claustrophobia and the start of a mega panic attack. Things became considerably worse for me though, as he pushed aside a few limbs from my right cheek in order to make way for his massive, wobbling, flamingo pink lips. He then started sucking with enormous power on my right cheek. "Don't worry, Alex," he lisped between sucks. "I'm just sucking out the fairy poison." "I don't need help," I cried. "I'm not allergic to fairies. I was just blushing because I've never been kissed by a fairy before." Harry begrudgingly released his lips from my cheek and sulkily returned to Frother's nose. "You mean I sucked on that earthling's yucky cheek for nothing?" he screamed and spat outwards bitterly. Whilst I felt a little bit insulted by his comment and the antics that followed, I appreciated that I would probably feel exactly the same way if I just sucked on his cheek for no particular reason. Harry suddenly noticed the blood pouring from several of my pussy pimples that his sucking action had accidentally ruptured. At this point, it obviously occurred to him that he may have inadvertently poisoned himself on earthling blood in the process. "I'm feeling really weak," he lisped softly. His eyes rolled backwards and his head fell forwards. Poor Harry had fainted. His willingness to be the hero would have to wait for another day. Magica had only just returned from Flush Fleas yesterday. She had enjoyed a really emotional reunion with her family, friends, and Flopsy. When the excitable Wobbit spotted her, he performed 3 perfect somersaults and then hopped tight circles around her for the next 5 minutes. The trip home had also given her an opportunity to speak to the ancient shrewd trees and to restock on grumpy bum drudgerworms. Magica unzipped her little fairy purse and pulled out one of these juicy drudgerworms. She parted Harry's lips and placed the drudgerworm into his mouth. Harry's eyes opened wide the moment the delicious aroma awoke his taste buds. The look of excitement on Harry's face was so funny that we all started laughing. The hot steam from Frother's laughter dried the wetness on my cheek that had been left by Harry's moist lips. It also helped to stop my pimples from bleeding. "I'm feeling much better," smiled Harry joyously. However, the look of joy turned to one of absolute shock, despair, and anguish, as an unexpected hiccup caused him to accidentally swallow the drudgerworm whole. "I just swallowed it by mistake!" he cried uncontrollably and covered his eyes. "I didn't even get to enjoy its heavenly gooey juices! Why do these things always happen to me? I feel sick again!" Harry continued the masquerade of self-pity and loathe until such time as Magica finally capitulated and gave him another drudgerworm. "Thank you so much, Magica," he smiled. He thought to himself sneakily. "Thee will never know I pretended to accidentally swallow the other one as well. I wonder how many more drudges she has in that pretty fairy purse of hers." Harry tested his theory, but despite an Oscar-winning performance, Magica was no fool and cut him down to size. "You obviously haven't heard the story about the gluten spider who cried Groglerbird," she shouted in a reprimanding tone. "No, sorry," replied Harry in a confused but still hopeful tone. "But it sounds like an awfully scary story. Is it a true story?" "No, Harry, it's not a true story, it's just a fable. You know, a fictional story with a moral lesson attached," continued Magica in her irritated teacher-like tone. "The point is you keep telling lies, you eventually won't be believed even when you are telling the truth. This particular gluten spider had told so many lies in the past that when he did in fact need help and cried out in desperation, nobody came to his aid because they thought he was lying yet again." "Poor little gluten spider," thought Harry to himself sadly. Tears welled up in his hazel eyes. "Nobody helped him. How cruel! How very, very cruel!" Harry had clearly missed the point of the story. "On Earth," I added, "we have a similar story about a young boy who cried wolf." "Interesting earthling, Alex. I bet this young boy's family and friends came to his rescue, unlike my cruel, cruel lot." "You're missing the point, Harry," shouted Magica. They never came to his aid because... Okay, enough already, screamed Harry in frustration. He had heard as much as he wanted to and decided to return to the business at hand. Does all of this mean I get another Dodger or not? Dementia took me on a trip of the new territory. This is the area where all the new homes were being constructed. In the very centre proudly stood the magnificent Orphanage of Love. It had escaped the final battle completely unscathed. It looked more like a children's fantasy land than a traditional orphanage. The walls were brightly coloured in various hues of yellow, orange, pink, blue and green. In its gardens stood massive double-storey cubby houses with thick climbing ropes connecting them to each other. Dementia introduced me to his friend, Wertheimer, the town planning and housing construction manager, all rolled into one. I must admit, it took all of my concentration to remain focused on his head rather than its neighbouring backside as he spoke. He just looked so odd. Had his exposed bum cheeks been covered over with underpants or shorts, I would have no doubt coped much better than I did, but they weren't. A million fart and smelly breath jokes cruelly swarmed my immature juvenile mind. It took a lot of self-restraint to prevent myself from exploding like a giggling Gertie. I so desperately wanted to grab hold of one of those thick marker pens and draw facial features on this blank fleshy canvas. Wertheimer's team of friendlies were busily sketching drawings of how the houses and buildings in the new land of hope would look. The pictures showed beautiful yet humble-looking double-storey houses. According to the diagrams, each house was going to be painted in a unique hue. All up, there'll be 2,000 different colours, smiled Wertheimer. The different colours will symbolise the fact that, although we're all different from one another, together we all harmonise like a rainbow. It was certainly a very strong metaphor and would make for a dazzling display. I could not wait to see the finished product. The diagrams also showed that every street would be lined with fruit trees of varying descriptions. Some of the fruits looked very weird and wonderful. My favourite was the fruit of the grin tree. The fruits looked like a set of big smiling lips, like two red-coloured Siamese twin bananas. Every front yard would have a sizable vegetable patch and herb garden. Several kids' play areas were also being designed. Large areas of common land had been set aside for growing crops and rearing livestock. As we walked around, I viewed more than 1,000 houses at various stages of completion. A myriad of different creatures were hard at work. I correctly guessed that the fluffy white soccer balls were coolaboos, and that the blue shimmering broad beans were lentinas. An enormous creature with thick curly brown hair was assisting them with a lot of the heavier work. He looked like a permed version of Bigfoot. I watched him lift an enormous roof beam into the air, as if it were made of polystyrene. I did not even need to see his caring aquamarine eyes to know it was Sked. Dementia introduced me to Sked, and despite his head unconsciously retracting slightly into his chest cavity, he smiled warmly. His eyes spoke of peace and goodwill. Sked called out the names Fluffle! Hildegard! One of the soccer balls, with particularly luscious black lips and the warmest of brown puppy dog eyes, wobbled its way towards us. It was followed close behind by a very slim banana in shimmering blue-scaled pyjamas, who walked so strangely that it resembled someone trying to do the goose step whilst walking barefoot through a field of fawns. It was great to finally meet Hildegard and Fluffle. Both had dared to stand up for what they believed to be right. They had risked their lives in the pursuit of freedom and a better life. They had also fought bravely on the battlefield. They now had the opportunity to create their own destinies, and were taking it with open hands. Fluffle and Hildegard were both very excited to meet me, and made me feel most welcome. I must confess that I found it extremely difficult to understand everything that they said, though, especially when they spoke at exactly the same time. It was like having a conversation with one of those squeaky-voiced Furby toys in triple time, whilst also trying to listen to Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh in slow time. I immediately thought about my sheepdog Jessie, who is always trying to catch one tennis ball in her mouth, whilst her mouth is still occupied by another. I now shared her frustration at trying to do two conflicting things at once. Dementia explained how everyone had an important role to play in the building of the new land of hope. The Koolaboos were responsible with filling the mud brick moulds with the correct mix of mud and dried out grass. It was the perfect job for them, because they stood only slightly higher than the mud brick moulds, so they didn't have to bend down at all. The Lentinas were strong and tall and very experienced bricklayers. They had been slave-driven bricklayers for years under the dictatorship of the nasty Ryboltians. Sked being a notable exception. It was different now, though. They were no longer building lavish houses for ungrateful dictators. They were now building humble houses for themselves and the other grateful citizens of the Land of Hope. They were building because they wanted to, not because they were being forced to. As each new layer of bricks and mortar went up on each house, Dementia would move from one construction site to the next, saying blessings designed to protect the structures from evil magic. His young nephew, Zula, was acting as his apprentice. To Dementia's annoyance, instead of his new charge concentrating fully on this complex chant, Zula's thoughts continually drifted towards the gorgeous Magica. Frother and 3 other Doolan dragons on loan courtesy of King Flambe were hard at work baking the mud bricks. It was a spectacular sight to watch them breathing out huge flame after huge flame. Frother clearly took great pride in his job. His flames were more ferocious and lasted far longer than any of the other Doolan dragons. Not a bad effort for a dragon who had spent most of his life flameless. Magica was once again hard at work, flying over the shallow trenches that had been meticulously prepared by the friendlies and dropping seeds at intervals of 1/2 metre. She was accompanied by Twinkle Dust, Honey Pop, and Wandina. Magica's mind also continually drifted as she thought about Zula. What a spunk, she thought, and fluttered her wings towards him suggestively whenever his indigo blue eyes met hers. Please concentrate on the job at hand, Magica! Shouted Twinkle Dust, after narrowly missing crashing into the back of her younger, daydreaming sister. I don't feel like having a mid-air collision. It's impossible for me to describe all the friendlies to you. It would be like trying to describe every stamp in a large stamp album. Let me just say that they range dramatically in size, colour, shape, and configuration. Despite being such a diverse and eclectic group, they shared one thing in common that far outweighed appearances: a desire to live in peace and harmony. Hairy, of course, was lounging on a large rock, polishing off a skewer that contained a variety of disgusting insects. He had fashioned the skewer from one of the abandoned long spines of an oversized porcupine-like creature called a polyver. Every time anyone would come within eyeshot of him, the conniving pumpkin spider would quickly conceal the skewer in a crack in the rock, clutched at his stomach dramatically and scream out, "Oh dear, the pain in my stomach is unbelievable!" In this way, he avoided lifting a finger other than to hold his skewer. Magica, Hairy and Frother had made a commitment to stay on in the Land of Hope until it had been properly rebuilt and established. They would then all return to Flush Fleas. Dementia had decided that he would live out the rest of his life here. He would make sure that all the orphans were well looked after and raised as good citizens. He would also do his best to protect all citizens from any evil forces that may try to encroach in the future. Willowwood and his delightful Violina would remain in Dementia's care until such time as they were old enough to tie the knot and start procreating. They would return to Elkwood Castle every 6 months to keep it from falling into disrepair, and also to keep up relations with their friendly Golfy Bob neighbours. King Lutitius had kindly offered to maintain its enormous grounds and to keep an eye out for any unwelcome visitors. Sked also intended to stay on forever in the Land of Hope. He had no desire whatsoever to return to his evil kind in the land of Ryboltia. Rather, he envisaged himself spending his work days planting trees and sowing vegetables, and his weekends painting the new landscape that he would help create. He could not wait to plant the hundreds of gold tree seeds that a Doolan dragon named Doodlebreath had kindly brought back for him after a recent hunting expedition in the land of Ryboltia. He also dreamed of creating a large stream that would run through the centre of town. He would need to discuss this with Wertheimer and his team of town planners. It would be a massive job, but nobody seemed to be afraid of hard work. Perhaps they could even set aside some funds to employ the services of the gigantic Wallyworms to do this for them. Wallyworms are the largest known creature to exist in the greater universe. They're all over 100 meters long and the same diameter as your average train tunnel. They make easy work of creating deep ditches for future streams. Their heads are the shape of a drill bit and their bodies are the shape of a corkscrew. Their skin is as tough as stone and resembles the sharp corrugations that adorn the outsides of stainless steel cheese graters. It allows them to effortlessly slice their way through the toughest of soils. I was having so much fun that I completely failed to keep my eye on the time. This lack of focus came with the territory of being an excited daydreamer. I was totally caught up in my new world. In my defence, well, sort of, Dementia had promised to inform me when it was time to go. He, of course, had also become sidetracked and forgotten to do so. It was only when Willowwood pointed out the time that both Dementia and I panicked. It was already 5:15 p.m, and I was meant to be home for Friday night dinner by 5. My parents would be worried sick as to my whereabouts by now. I hurriedly said my farewells to all, and then Dementia performed his magic. The roller coaster ride home was far less severe. We had obviously encountered very little turbulence. I arrived at the isolated cave at 5:17 p.m. Dementia and Willowwood promised to pick me up at 2 p.m. next Friday. We would be visiting Flush Fleas. How was I going to survive a whole week without seeing these exciting creatures? I pondered this as I made my way home and worked on some sort of lame excuse to account for my late arrival. Could not believe that my parents fell for the old "my watch wasn't working properly" excuse. I had set my imitation Rolex back an entire hour and simply showed them its shiny face to prove my case. So in fact, I arrived home more than half an hour early, I lied to them with a straight face. I would have to be more careful in the future though, because as our parish priest often says in his grim voice, "Lays always eventually catch up with you." Whilst I sat down for a delicious home-cooked meal and reflected on my fascinating day, Dementia rocked restlessly in his favourite armchair. Only hours after the demise of Trezon, Dementia had made 2 extremely disturbing discoveries, which he was still keeping to himself and bearing the heavy burden for alone. He decided not to share the distressing details with anyone else, at least not yet, because he did not want to put a dampener on everything positive that had been achieved over the last few days in the Land of Hope. Its citizens all deserved a break from fear and dread. The first troubling discovery was that Trezon's memorial diamond, which Sked had smashed through the top-story window of the orphanage, had been stolen. The second, and arguably more disturbing discovery, was the small bunches of distinctive-looking black, grape-like feathers that he had found at and around the crime scene. Only the legendary flying assassins, more commonly known as cabats, cat bats, had feathers that looked like this. He pondered how this could be, though. The last of these evil creatures were known to have become extinct over 400 years ago, when the dark period known as the Days of the Black Vibrating Clouds finally ended. How had they managed to suddenly reincarnate themselves, and why would they want Trezon's memorial diamond anyway? Had they deliberately left a few of their distinctive bunches of feathers as an ominous calling card, or had these simply fallen out accidentally? He suspected the former. Given these startling discoveries, there was only one option. He would need to make a hasty visit to his best friend ever, Old Fuzzy, and his adorable dragon dogs.